The rain over Port Charles had a way of turning confessions into currency. It slicked the pavement, smudged the streetlights, and made every breath feel like a wager. On the night everything shifted, the storm was only weather to most people. To Willow, it was cover. To Michael, it was leverage. And to the PCPD, it would become a stopwatch counting down to a reckoning. Michael didn't knock when he stepped into Elizabeth's house. He arranged the moment the way he arranges everything, precisely, efficiently, with just enough warmth to pass for kindness and just enough steel to make refusal feel dangerous. He stood in that quiet living room like a man who had paid ahead for fate, hands in pockets, jaw set, waiting for the sound of a key in the door. When Willow came in, dripping from a late storm and carrying a silence that felt heavier than her coat, he said her name once, soft, almost apologetic, and then laid out the terms. Wiley and Amelia. 1 hour a week. A licensed family therapist in the room and a firm boundary around the one name she could not bring with her, Drew. He delivered the proposal like an offer of amnesty, but there was an ultimatum braided through every syllable. The deal wasn't about reconciliation, it was about control. He was telling her that the smallest piece of her old life, motherhood on a timer, could still be returned if she honored the new balance of power. Willow bristled. Of course she did. She tried to muster righteous anger, to earn the catharsis of a door slammed hard enough to rattle its frame, but anger is expensive when you owe a debt to the truth. What came out instead was a careful negotiation with herself, a measured inhalation, a catalogue of what she could not afford to lose, and then the smallest of nods. She agreed. 1 hour a week, observed. No, Drew. Michael's features softened just enough to look human again. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Victory looks quieter in a man who knows it will be the first of many. Across town, the PCPD hummed with the low-voltage tension that fills a room when a secret is close to changing hands. Files lay open like peeled fruit on the duty desks. The night shift had learned to keep their voices down when Anna was in the building. The hush wasn't deference so much as self-preservation. She navigates a case the way a surgeon goes after a tumor, every incision clean, every movement purposeful, no space for performance. Dante worked beside her, thoughtful where others would be reactive, and together they made a kind of dangerous symmetry. Between them, evidence didn't survive unless it held up to 2 angles of scrutiny and a third of intuition. They'd walked the chain of suspects with the patience of people who expected the floor to give way under at least one story. Michael's alibi, threadbare and strategic, had gotten a raised eyebrow from Dante and a thin, unimpressed line of a mouth from Anna. It wasn't enough to hang him, not when he'd learned to speak fluent ambiguity, but it wasn't enough to protect him either. What changed the weather in the room was a flash drive in a sealed bag, labeled unlogged from a midtown building where good intentions go to evaporate, Nina's apartment. The grainy footage should have been mundane. No masked intruder. No hurried exchange of contraband. Just square footage and furniture and routine. But truth often arrives as an absence. The timestamp framed a window of time that had been promised to a different narrative. Nina was on camera, alone, pacing, phone silent, at the exact moment she claimed to be with Willow, pouring tea and excuses, telling the police that the younger woman had not stepped out into the downpour when Drew was shot. The video did not accuse, it simply existed. And existence dismantled an alibi that had tried to harden into fact. Anna didn't smile. Dante didn't either. Small victories are not celebrations, they are doors. And this one opened onto the one name Anna had been careful not to say too soon, Willow. The nurse, who had vanished from General Hospital for a slice of an hour and returned damp and rattled, had told a story about needing fresh air, about rain clearing the mind, about a walk that was not long enough to matter. The footage converted that story into a liability and her protector into an unreliable narrator. It didn't prove she had fired the shot. It proved that someone had been willing to build a shelter over her timeline, and that shelter had just been torn away. In the space where emotion might have fit, Anna placed procedure. She asked for traffic cams, for cab receipts, for elevator logs in buildings within a 10-block radius of the hospital. She requested stills, then motion, then audio where audio existed, building a net with the elegance of someone who has caught sharks and knows not to be fooled by a guppy's smile. Dante, who understood the neighborhood of Michael's mind as well as anyone who doesn't live there can understand it, made a list on a legal pad, favors Michael could call in, friends who confuse loyalty with silence, and the handful of people who would tell the truth even if it cost them something dear. Names of therapists, too, not because he expected to find a confession in a session note, but because paper trails have a way of leading the willing and the unwilling to the same door. Meanwhile, the Quartermain estate, never shy about providing the city with a theater in which power and sentiment can wrestle for an audience, had become a palace of mixed blessings. Ronnie had inherited the house, and houses that size arrive with ghosts whether you believe in them or not. Michael stood under the portrait of history and confessed to a different kind of calculus, his voice low, his words precise. He spoke of obligations and optics, of the way a father must appear in public while waging private wars, and of the luxury of letting the law do what the law is designed to do. Ronnie listened as someone who has learned that family is a legal term only by accident. He didn't offer absolution, he isn't a priest, but he offered the one thing Michael always covets, perspective. What power you keep by force you spend twice as fast. What power you earn by discipline tends to last long enough to build a future on. None of that solved the problem of the bullet that tore through a life and left a city split into believers and doubters. It did, however, clarify motive. Drew had become a fulcrum, and people who become fulcrums often get crushed by competing leverage. For Willow, the equation had a terrible simplicity: a man she cared for was in danger, another man she once built a life with was spiraling toward a version of himself neither of them could respect, and every tear she shed seemed to be catalogued as evidence against someone else's soul. If she left the hospital that night, it was because she thought motion might convert fear into action. If she returned soaked, it was because action in Port Charles often ends where it begins, in the rain. Nina's lie, when Anna finally placed it on the table, looked less like malice and more like reflex. Mothers perform triage with the tools they have, and Nina's tools have always been narrative and proximity. She thought she could buffer one girl against a storm by stepping into the story herself. She believed, foolishly, tenderly, that a well-placed sentence could hold back a tide. When confronted with the footage, she didn't crumble, she stiffened. The human body often mistakes shame for rage. She tried to widen the context, to argue that time is elastic, to insist that she had misremembered because worry distorts a clock. Anna let the protest run until it exhausted itself and then asked the only question that matters in rooms like these: if not you, then who? And if not then, when? Dante did the other half of the work, following the physics of rain. He traced wet footprints where they should not have been, checked a nurse's locker for an umbrella that hadn't opened, and timed the walk from the ER doors to the places one could hide sorrow and a weapon at the same time. The city is small when you measure it by secrets. He never said Willow's name until he had to. Names, said too early, become scapegoats. Said on time, they become keys. News of the unraveling alibi traveled faster than anyone wanted it to. Port Charles has a way of pretending it respects privacy while purchasing tickets to every scandal in advance. By morning, people were speaking in careful euphemisms at Kelly's and careless certainties at the Metro Court. Willow's colleagues at GH looked at her with a cocktail of concern and morbid curiosity. Nurses understand triage, and gossip is a kind of wound care in a town that confuses proximity with intimacy. Willow moved through the halls like a person whose skin had become too thin to keep the world out. The hour with her children began to feel less like a promise and more like a countdown to confession. Michael did not gloat publicly, he rarely does, but the set of his shoulders announced that he had, for the moment, seized the weather. Yet even leverage collects interest. When a father dictates the terms under which a mother can see her children, he acquires not just power but also a responsibility to justify it. Ronnie, who knows what palaces do to men, asked a simple question that lodged like a stone in Michael's shoe: if you win everything, will there be enough of you left to raise them? Michael didn't answer. Men who trade in control never answer immediately, they file the question and hope the filing cabinet can hold the weight. On the investigative side, the clock on Drew's case began to organize itself around a single proposition: if Willow is innocent, then her absence and her return soaked with rain must serve a different story, one that explains the gap without draping her in guilt. If she is guilty, then the absence and the rain are camouflage. Anna is allergic to lazy conclusions. She prefers proofs. She followed the phone pings, the card swipes, the places where soggy footprints turned to dry tile. She built models of the night in her mind and then tried to break them. The one that kept refusing to collapse was the one in which the shot was fired by someone who believed the act would save a life rather than end a feud. Intent is not innocence, but it can be the difference between a prison sentence and a prayer. When the October 9th episode closed, it didn't do so with a bang. It allowed dread to seep in through the seams, the way rain finds its place under a window sash. The city went to sleep pretending it didn't have a favorite outcome. The teaser for the next day refused to indulge the fantasy. Michael would bring his secrets to Ronnie, trying to square a ledger that does not forgive arithmetic errors. The Quartermaine mansion, newly inherited and full of the kind of history that eats the future if you let it, would offer both men a mirror. The PCPD would prepare warrants and warnings. And Willow, caught between a man who promises structure and a city that promises judgment, would have to decide which truth she could live with, the one she tells the law, or the one she tells herself. There is a point in every Port Charles storm when the lightning has struck and the thunder has rolled and the only sound left is the rain, steady and indifferent. That's when people make the choices that define them. Michael has already made his, fashioning parenthood into a contract with fine print nobody else was allowed to read. Anna has made hers too, refusing to let affection, fatigue, or public opinion bend the spine of her inquiry. Dante has chosen patience over spectacle. Nina has chosen instinct over accuracy and will pay for it with credibility she cannot easily repurchase. And Willow is standing in the doorway between two rooms, one labeled sacrifice and the other survival, trying to remember which door has a lock on the inside and which one does not. If she pulled the trigger, it was because fear had convinced her that action is mercy by another name. If she didn't, then someone is counting on the town's eagerness to make her into a story easier to tell than the truth. Either way, the storm will pass, the pavement will dry, and the city will go about its business. But the next time Port Charles smells rain, it will remember this night, the hour traded for hope, the alibi that dissolved under fluorescent light, the inheritance that became a confession booth, and the way a woman walked back into a hospital so wet with weather and worry that anyone who saw her knew, without being told, that something irreversible had already happened.